This is Jeff Spittler, June 18th, 2000, A Tale of Two Kingdoms, Part 29. Well, I told most of you this story already, but if I seem a little dazed or unkempt this morning, it's because I had this 2x4 with a bolt sticking out of it plow a furrow through my scalp yesterday. You got a gash about like that. We were moving something in the garage, and I had this thing for a gambrel hanging up there, and it got caught. And it kind of went, and then all of a sudden it must have just swung, got free and swung down. So, however, the guy that was working with me finished unloading the truck, so, it wasn't all bad. So.
You start throwing King James and sanctified Christian,
Yeah. Okay. Well, last time we covered how Charles continued in his foolishness, imposing a new book of canons and this new book of common prayer, in other words, a new liturgy. We talked with some glee about the sort of reception that the new liturgy received on the 23rd of July, 1537, when someone, namely, or supposedly Jenny Geddes, threw a stool at the dean of Edinburgh there. We looked into how Charles repeatedly refused to hear any petitions from the people, how the resistance to Charles was organized by the estates, by the nobles, the lairds, the burgesses, and the church. And finally, how Charles cut off all legal forms of appeal, and he ended up leaving the people no other choice but to take some bold step. And this bold step was the writing and subscribing of a national covenant. Okay, let's see. Hetherington explains that the nobles felt it was unwise to go further in the resistance without any sort of written bond or contract. And as we've seen from the history of Scotland that we've looked at, when people have gone into taken some serious measure like this that could be interpreted as treasonous, how they often wrote up a bond of self-defense and an explanation of what they were doing and so on. Several of the ministers became convinced that the church and nation were suffering the natural and penal consequences of their own defections. Okay, specifically, these would be defections from the previous covenant of 1581 and the confessions or books of discipline of faith that it incorporated. So the King's Confession, remember how that came about, we think, because James needed something to sort of spin things and came up with this anti-Catholic confession. By allowing all of the changes in church government and worship, the church had gone against its previous confession of faith and its covenant to maintain the faith. So on the 25th of February, 1638, a Sabbath, they held a public fast, and apparently the church's defections were a prominent topic of sermons throughout the land. And the next day, the Committee of Estates appointed a minister, Alexander Henderson, and a lawyer, Archibald Johnston of Warriston, to draft a new covenant. And then three earls, the earls of Rosse, Loudon, and Balmerino, remember him, were appointed to review and edit the document. So they produced a draft, and they had some extensive discussion. And by Wednesday of that week, it was finalized. Okay, so it was made up of three parts. First part is the King's Confession of 1581. So if you looked at that last week, it should would look familiar to you. The second part, the part written by the attorney, if you looked at it, you probably tell that it goes on and on about the various acts of Parliament that established the Church and the Reformed faith, condemned popery, and so on. It gives the legal basis for the Church's position. And the third part was written by Henderson, the minister, and it gives the modern application of the previous covenants, modern as of 1638, for things that had been done nearly 80 years ago. Let's see. Did all of you read this last week? Some of you did. Okay. Well, I printed off the last part. I was planning on reading just the third part. I was going to skip over the fourth act of the Second Parliament of King James, all the list of laws. But It says, we noblemen, barons, gentlemen, burgesses, ministers, and commons, undersubscribing, considering diverse times before, and especially at this time, the danger of the true reformed religion, of the king's honor and of the public peace of the kingdom by the manifold innovations and evils generally contained and particularly mentioned in our late supplications, complaints, and protestations. Do hereby profess, and before God, his angels in the world, solemnly declare that with our whole heart we agree and resolve all the days of our life constantly to adhere unto and to defend the aforesaid true religion, and forbearing the practice of all innovations already introduced in the matters of the worship of God, or of approbation of the corruptions of the public government of the Kirk, or civil places and power of Kirkmen, till they be tried and allowed in free assemblies and in Parliament, to labor by all means lawful to recover the purity and liberty of the gospel, as it was established and professed before the aforesaid innovations. And because after due examination we plainly perceive and undoubtedly believe that the innovations and evils contained in our supplications, complaints, and protestations have no warrant of the word of God, are contrary to the articles of the aforesaid confession. I should point out that's an important distinction, is that they are contrary to the articles of this confession of 1581. In meaning of the blessed reformers of religion in this land, to the above written acts of Parliament, and do sensibly tend to the re-establishing of the popish religion and tyranny, and to the subversion and ruin of the true reformed religion, and of our liberties, laws, and estates, we also declare that the aforesaid confessions are to be interpreted, and ought to be understood of the aforesaid innovations evils, no less than if every one of them had been expressed in the aforesaid confessions, and that we are obliged to detest and abhor them, amongst other particular heads of papistry abjured therein. And therefore, from the knowledge and conscience of our duty to God, to our king and country, without any worldly respect or inducement, so far as human infirmity will suffer, wishing a further measure of the grace of God for this effect, we promise and swear by the great name of the Lord our God, to continue in the profession and obedience of the aforesaid religion, and that we shall defend the same and resist all these contrary errors and corruptions according to our vocation, and to the uttermost of that power that God hath put in our hands all the days of our life. Okay, so if you go back and read the confession, it won't explicitly list, for example, kneeling at communion, but I think they put, several phrases in here to indicate that they interpret it that way, which, I think is a very fair interpretation. Okay, but to continue. And in like manner, with the same heart, we declare before God men that we have no intention nor desire to attempt anything that may turn to the dishonor of God, or to the diminution of the king's greatness and authority. But on the contrary, we promise and swear that we shall, to the uttermost of our power, with our means in life, stand in defense of our dread sovereign, the king's majesty, his person and authority, in the defense and preservation of the aforesaid true religion, liberties and laws of the kingdom, as also to mutual defense and assistance, every one of us, of another, in the same cause of maintaining the true religion and his majesty's authority, with our best counsel, our bodies, means, and whole power against all sorts of persons whatsoever. Could even be the king. So that whatsoever shall be done to the least of us for that cause shall be taken as done to us all in general, and to every one of us in particular. And that we shall neither directly nor indirectly suffer ourselves to be divided or withdrawn by whatsoever suggestion, combination, allurement, or terror from this blessed and loyal conjunction, nor shall cast in any lot or impediment that may stay or hinder any such resolution as by common consent shall be found to conduce for so good ends. But on the contrary, shall by all lawful means labor to further and promote the same. And if any such dangerous and divisive notion be made to us by word or writ, we and every one of us shall either suppress it, or, if need be, shall incontinent make the same known, that it may be tenaciously obviated. Neither do we fear the foul aspersions of rebellion, combination, or what else our adversaries from their craft and malice would put upon us, seeing what we do is so well warranted and ariseth from an unfeigned desire to maintain the true worship of God, the majesty of our King, and the peace of the kingdom, for the common happiness of ourselves and our posterity. Because we cannot look for a blessing from God upon our proceedings, except with our profession and subscription, we join such a life and conversation as beseemeth Christians who have renewed their covenant with God. We therefore faithfully promise for ourselves, our followers, and all others under us, both in public and in our particular families, in personal carriage, to endeavor to keep ourselves within the bounds of Christian liberty, and to be good examples to others of all godliness, soberness, and righteousness, and of every duty we owe God and man. And that this our union, our conjunction, may be observed without violation, we call the living God, the searcher of our hearts, to witness, who knoweth this to be our sincere desire and unfeigned resolution, that as we shall answer to Jesus Christ in the great day, and under the pain of God's everlasting wrath, and of infamy and loss of all honor and respect in this world, Most humbly beseeching the Lord to strengthen us by his Holy Spirit for this end, and to bless our desires and proceedings with a happy success, that religion and righteousness may flourish in the land, to the glory of God, the honor of our King, and peace and comfort of us all. In witness whereof we have subscribed with our hands all the premises. Okay, so in doing this, they tried to make it clear that they weren't trying to be treasonous, that they weren't rejecting the king's authority, but of course they were rejecting his authority in the area of the government of the church. And at least one commentator pointed out that this promises they made to the king were sort of to the Covenanters' detriment later on. They always, well, as Mike says, were gullible, but they always treated the king, they always gave the king the benefit of the doubt. So, okay. There was also at that time some question about their interpretation. Specifically, they really needed sort of a general assembly to actually pass judgment on whether or not those things were true, but whether or not they were interpreting them correctly. But the General Assembly did meet later and did approve that interpretation. Okay, well, the National Covenant itself was first subscribed at Greyfriars Church in Edinburgh. The 5 men who drafted and edited the document came forward. This was on Wednesday afternoon. Henderson, the minister, opened the meeting in prayer. The Earl of Loudoun gave the historical background for the covenant, the reasons for drawing it up, and then Warriston read it aloud. They gave a time for people with doubts or questions about the covenant to come forward and question either Loudon or Dixon at the south and west doors of the church. And this took a little time, and shortly thereafter, people began to sign the document. It was completely covered with signatures, and some apparently signed in blood, and some adding to death after their signature. So, there's a famous painting or drawing of the signing. There may be more than one, but it shows the people signing it on flat gravestones in the churchyard. These stones look like stone tables. That's what they look like. But when we visited there, somebody told us that those didn't actually exist at the time, so the painting, which was done much later, was somewhat anachronistic. But I have a little, in my notes here, a little picture of it, so when we get far enough, I'll past the end of this page, I'll pass it around. Okay, in the next few days, a number of duplicate copies were made. Let's see, I guess they eventually did print some, but my impression was that these were handwritten. They're made, and they were signed locally and distributed throughout the kingdom. So a number of these representatives of the estates from the various parishes and shires that were there in Edinburgh took them back with them. And according to James King Hewison, within 3 weeks, the greater part of the kingdom had subscribed the covenant. Let's see. Well, most people signed willingly. There were some people who probably signed under various kinds of pressure. There were some reports that people in Ayrshire were being refused food and lodging until they assured the innkeeper that they had signed the covenant. The people who didn't sign it were called discovenanters. One of the ministers who was not a covenanter, a guy named David Mitchell, he was later became a bishop. He gave this account, and I thought, I mean, this is sort of the opposition perspective, but it's kind of interesting. He was writing a letter on the 19th of March to the Bishop of Raphoe, John Wesley. He said, "The greater part of the kingdom have subscribed, and the rest are daily subscribing a covenant." Well, maybe I should mention that most of the bishops and ministers had fled to England, but it is the oath of the King's House, 1580, with strange additions, a mutual combination for resistance of all novations in religion, doctrine, discipline, and rites of worship that have been brought in since that time, so as if the least of the subscribers be touched, and there be some of them not 10 years of age, and some not worth 2 pence, that all shall concur for their defense, and for the expulsion of all papists and adversaries, that is, all that will not subscribe out of the church and kingdom, according to the laws whereof 100 are cited in the charter. This goes on apace. The true pastors are brought into Edinburgh to cry out against us wolves. And they, with our brethren here, Mr. Andrew Ramsay, Mr. Henry Rawlock, and your Wilson friend, the principal, crying out they are neither good Christians nor good subjects that do not subscribe, nay, nor in covenant with God, have made us so odious that we dare not go in the streets. I have been dogged by some gentlemen and followed with many mumbled threatenings behind my back, and then went in stairs, swords drawn, and if they had the papist villain, oh. Yet I thank God I am living to serve God and the king and the church and your lordship. Your chief, Rothes, is chief in this business. There's nothing expected here but civil war. There is no meeting of council. The chancellor may not with safety attend it, nor any bishop. The very name is more odious among the old and young than the devil's. So it wasn't just people signing, a covenant. There was obviously a lot of emotion going out. As these bishops or so on walking around Edinburgh wouldn't have been treated very well. But there is more to it than that, too. This is an account given by John Livingstone. I was present at Lanark and at several other parishes when on a Sabbath after the afternoon sermon the covenant was read and sworn, and I may truly say that in all my lifetime, except one day at the Kirk of Shotts, I never saw such motions of the Spirit of God, all the people generally and most willingly concurring. I've seen more than 1,000 persons all at once lifting up their hands and the tears falling down from their eyes, so that through the whole land, except the professed papists and some few who for base ends adhered to the prelates, the people universally entered into the covenant of God. Guthrie said it was everywhere done with joy except in the north parts where many opposed it. So there was, there was quite a bit of religious fervor, say revival. I'm not, absolutely sure, but certainly it was widely signed. I think some of us had some discussions about how, in terms of these covenants binding people and so on, how, who actually took the covenant and on what terms. This one was taken by the masses, by everyone in society. So, or not every particular person, but every class of person. So, see this picture. Okay, well, what did Charles think about all this? You can guess. Okay, I mentioned last week this Committee of Estates, which formed a sort of alternative government. They called themselves the Tables, which I guess has some meaning. I mean, they didn't just pick this word at random, but it had a meaning roughly of being a committee. I think, and as I understand, the name was probably chosen so as not to sound too broad-reaching, too much of an alternative government, but that's more or less what they were. When Charles heard the news of this, he referred to the tables as, quote, this is a pun, stables of unruly horses. And now the first dung which from these stables was thrown upon the face of authority and government was that lewd covenant and seditious bands annexed unto it. Charles he certainly didn't like the King's Confession of Faith in 1581. He did say at one point that his father had regretted signing it. But anyways, again, even now it seems that Charles, he might have compromised by withdrawing the new liturgy and perhaps might have regained control of the situation, or perhaps not. Anyways, while he was no doubt stymied partly by the distance of, between London and Scotland, the time it took to communicate, send letters back and forth, and so on, he moved somewhat slowly. The Covenanters pressed on. The Earl of Traquair, the King's Commissioner, was recalled to London, and with him he carried a set of the Covenanters' demands. They went well beyond withdrawing the prayer book. They demanded a guarantee that the innovations would not be reintroduced and that a free General Assembly would meet. And while he was in London, the official church hierarchy, or rather what was left of it, met on the 27th of April. 3 bishops and 3 ministers remained. One of the ministers was the guy who wrote that letter. They prepared a report which indicated how far things had gone with the Covenanters. Most of the constant moderators had been deposed. Right, these would be the bishops who were acting as constant moderators of presbyteries. A number of pulpits had been filled without permission of the local bishop. Samuel Rutherford had returned to Anworth. Other previously banished ministers had returned home. So, when I said the Covenanters pressed on, they continued with the reform. Charles decided to appoint a new commissioner, probably, no doubt, much to the relief of the Earl of Traquair, who was, I think, very tired of the situation. So, as I mentioned, Charles would had this peculiarity where he would expect his commissioners to fulfill his will, even though they told him they thought it was a really bad idea. You know, they expect, he would go, no, you're not going to do that. Go back. So this new commissioner was the Marquis of Hamilton. He was 32 years old at the time. He was a relative of the king. He was from the House of Hamilton, and if Charles had died, leaving no heirs, this guy would have had a claim to the throne, possibly. Let's see. He primarily lived in England as a member of court. Said that. He did have a few years of military experience in the 30 Years' War. Okay. Well, Charles' instructions to Hamilton were basically that he should stall for time. He was given two versions of a proclamation to be used at his discretion. One version offered a pardon if all signed copies of the covenant were turned in. The other one was somewhat vaguer. It didn't require that. It just required some testimony of obedience that you were supposed to sign, and then everything would be forgiven. Why was Charles? Well, Charles was stalling for time because he was planning on sending an army up to sort things out. He was raising forces in England. He was trying to send shipping arms and ammunition to the castles in Scotland. The Covenanters knew this through their own network of spies. I say spies, but they received word back about what was happening in court and so on. And they were also raising their own arms quietly. So Hamilton was supposed to negotiate with them. He planned to issue the vaguer version of the proclamation. He figured there was no point in issuing the one that required all signed copies of the covenant to be turned in. But either version required he had to arrest anyone who protested the proclamation. And he was informed that the Covenanters were already preparing a protestation, because they had a rough idea, at least, of what was in the proclamation. So he was in a very awkward spot. It was awkward because, this was, again, by the lion's share of the people, this covenant had been subscribed. When he was received, he wanted some kind of official reception, which he didn't get. He got another kind of official reception. He was received near Leith, which is the port by Edinburgh, by 30 nobles, gentry standing in ranks along the seaside, being 1.5 miles long. So he had 1.5 miles worth of gentry, 600 ministers, and 20,000 people between Leith and Edinburgh. That was, according to a contemporary account, Hamilton himself probably thought there were 60,000 people. So it wasn't a show of honor, or it wasn't a display of honor. It was really a show of force. And if he started making arrests without an army, this thing about you and what army are going to do this, well, he didn't have the army to do it. So he just finally decided not to issue any proclamation. The king, in a letter, suggested he, quote, flatter them with what hopes you please. And so he finally ordered Hamilton to issue a milder proclamation on the 4th of July. He persuaded the Privy Council to issue this, to ratify the proclamation, but then the Privy Council changed their mind. The Covenanters persuaded most of the members to repent of their vote, and they forced him to tear it up. And they said if he didn't tear it up, they would go sign it. But they had, not all of them. Some of them had signed the covenant already, but most of them hadn't. They said if they didn't tear it up, if he didn't tear this up, they would go sign the covenant. So he did. Okay, by this time in July, both sides were openly preparing for war. Covenanters were organized on a parish-by-parish basis. They'd compiled rules of men able to fight and how much arms, ammunition, and horses they had. They also compiled a list of discovenanters, those who refused to sign the covenant. They started recruiting men from the Scots who had served overseas in the 30 Years' War. A number was quite common for there to be mercenaries in those days, and particularly a number of Scots. Scotland, having been at peace for a long time, were out plying their trade on the continent, fighting for various people. And some of them were recruited to come home. Hamilton went back to visit the king, and when he returned in August, the Covenanters were actually training men for war, running drills and so on. The king, again trying to further stall for time, it's been said that the king underestimated the amount of time it would take to raise an army. He came up with a rival covenant. Okay, it's one based on the Confession of Faith of 1560. Right, that was the first Confession of Faith, and if you remember, that one was the one that wasn't so clearly Presbyterian in the form of church government. It wasn't as settled. It wasn't until that would have been the first book of discipline, and then it wasn't until we got to the second book of discipline where the whole Presbyterian system was laid out a lot more clearly. Let's see. He also ordered Hamilton to call a general assembly. Okay, but this was conditioned on the Covenanters agreeing to the number of demands first. Okay, and these included restoration of ministers and bishops who had been deposed, that the Presbyterian moderators should have a seat in the assembly. So first they were supposed to restore the bishops to be moderators, and then the moderators were supposed to be part of the assembly. And that no lay elders would be able to help choose commissioners. Okay, so in other words, if this were the case, then the situation would have partly reverted to the status quo. In other words, the assembly would have still been the same assembly that would have met with, for the most part, the one that had been cowed by the king. Also the Covenanters would have stopped meeting. Okay, so of course the Covenanters did not agree. They're not always gullible, Mike. They argued that these things were ecclesiastical matters which could only be settled by a free General Assembly. With respect to the moderators having a seat, they argued that they'd been established by an unlawful assembly in 1606. With respect to lay elders having a part in electing the commissioners, they responded that it was part of the order of our church discipline, which it was if you go back to the books of discipline. Now, interestingly enough, the ministers didn't particularly support this. By this time, they'd been quite used to not having lay elders at presbytery meetings, even though it was in the second book of discipline in 1578. And probably at the same time, they had become more controllable because of this. If you recall, a lot of the threats and so on made by James and Charles were partly on the basis of the ministers' salaries, and presumably a lay elder wouldn't have been, as easily swayed by that consideration. The Covenanters finally did compromise, agreed to two stipulations to have this General Assembly. First of all, anything settled by Parliament previously would be referred to a new Parliament. So if the Church wanted to, say, eliminate the 5 Articles of Perth, basically they would do that, but then they would submit it to Parliament for ratification. And also agreed that lay elders wouldn't be able to help choose the commissioners. Okay, so after some time they agreed on the 25th of August to these terms. Hamilton actually went back to London again. When he came back in September, they were supposed to have their elections. Let's see. He went back to London. He conferred with the king and Archbishop Laud, among others, who, of course, are still giving the king bad advice. But he comes up with another set of concessions. A new covenant, which this covenant did incorporate the King's Confession of 1581, and an anti-Catholic ban of 1589. Hamilton was to appoint commissioners for each shire to force people to sign this new covenant. And it was really aimed at dividing the Covenanters. It was sort of superficially fair. It was much better than anything else they had. So if you refused to sign it, might seem somewhat unreasonable. But as Donald Stevenson points out, it says, the very day the concessions were proclaimed, Charles wrote to Hamilton mentioning the sending of Canon North to Hall, and the king greatly disliked the king's covenant he ordered his subjects to sign. It was merely a weapon to divide and embarrass his enemies. Okay, the Covenanter leaders saw through this, and even though many of the ministers didn't, they were willing to take the king's concessions at face value. But the Covenanters made a successful argument against signing this covenant, and I think it goes back to this, what the argument they made is that it would be, signing this covenant would in effect repudiate the previous covenant. Let's see. And in their covenant, they said, and that we shall neither directly nor indirectly suffer ourselves to be divided or withdrawn by whatsoever suggestion, combination, allurement, or terror from this blessed and loyal conjunction. Okay, I didn't read the arguments that they made. I mean, they came out with like a new little tract on why this new covenant couldn't be signed, but presumably it's clearly an attempt at dividing them. Okay, now when I say the ministers lagged behind, not all of the ministers did. I mean, there was very clearly a sort of what's sometimes today called the radical party of the Kirk. The Samuel Rutherfords and Alexander Hendersons and so on did not, they weren't lagging behind and taking the king's concessions at face value. Okay, so finally, elections were held by the presbyteries and the General Assembly began meeting on the 21st of November, 1638. They met until the 20th December, not necessarily every day. So I'm actually going to leave what they did the next time. It's pretty interesting because there's some interchanges between the king's commissioner and the assembly, and then finally the assembly just goes on and does business, basically repealing everything that's been done since 1580 that was injurious to the church. So, questions? Mike?
It seems to me like this preparatory for essentially revolution was much more abominable than our own revolution. I don't think our own revolution had anything to do with religion.
I'm sorry, it was much more... It had a better basis, is that what you mean? Yeah, well, I mean, obviously they were preparing for defensive war, but it was somewhat analogous to our own revolution. But you're saying it had a much more explicitly religious basis.
Well, it had grounds for doing it. Yeah. For instance, the king was taking away the freedom of worship.
Yeah.
Yeah. And ours was never, I don't recall anybody ever saying that was legal part of it.
No, he's taking away other freedoms in our case. So.
Yeah. Drink tea. I mean, that's on tea.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whatever.
Well. Yeah, well, I guess that brings us to a whole other question about the current day, but we'll avoid that for the moment.
But I'm very
Dr. Reese.
What was some theological events
There was... that, with respect to that, I've not seen a lot, no. I mean, the question was there a lot of theological debate about preparing for a military action? No, I think what we've seen is that Charles has basically forced them into this. You know, they basically either had to completely give up any idea that Christ was king over the church and that they could somehow, I mean, they tried to petition the king to hear their grievances, and with respect to freedom of, well, maybe I shouldn't say freedom of worship, but the freedom to worship in a biblical manner, and he'd ignored it. So I've not yet seen a lot. I'm going mainly, there's a couple accounts. One is in this book by James Hewison King called The Covenanters. So, and the other one is, that was published in 1905 or 1913, somewhere early on. And then the other one is, and so this is, I should say, Hewison's account is pretty much from a Christian sort of perspective. I think I've mentioned a few things before where I wouldn't agree with him, but he, anyways, it's more from a religious perspective. And then this book, The Scottish Revolution, 1637 to 1644, by David Stevenson, and it's more of a political discussion. But neither one of them spends very much time on this issue of whether or not there was a theological debate with respect to preparing for arms and so on. And I think the nobles and so on, who had, in a sense, largely been silent for a number of years, saw what was happening, and there were some other things. Is basically, they were very, very seriously being stepped on. And with things like the Parliament being packed by the king's bishops and so on. So, other questions? Gotcha question. That last one was so interesting. They were very concerned, actually, when he offered this alternative covenant that it would really divide their ranks. And so they went, Archibald Johnston of Warriston went to work on this tract explaining why they shouldn't sign the covenant. But it turned out to be primarily a non-issue. So. Well, they were the ministers didn't want to issue a protestation against it as a body. So, but again, especially reading Stevenson, I've made some notes of various places where he talks about the ministers, but of course doesn't mention this background of having been intimidated and persecuted and harassed for so long that a lot of the ministers that were left were very compliant. So, but not all of them. Yeah, some were feisty. So.
I'm just wondering, there's probably no way to assess the extent to which money and power was still playing into this. And certainly there had to be some of that going on here. And I'm wondering if there's any way to calibrate that. It's a little disconcerting. You can dismiss the fact that the ministers wouldn't sign by saying that, well, they were all liberal by that anyway, which might be.
I don't know that they're all liberal, but I mean some of them. I mean I think they're more compliant.
Yeah.
But anyway, sorry.
So I guess I wondered if there's any way to calibrate that from if you ran across anything that.
The one thing that I've ran across with respect to money and so on was that the sort of leaders of the Covenanter movement, as it were, when they were petitioning the king, even issuing further demands, they always they never mentioned the issue of church lands and so on. They just completely left that off the radar screen. So I think Stevenson may have said they craftily omitted it or something, or omitted it, but maybe they omitted it for political reasons. But, I think at the least you could say that wasn't the main issue, and they weren't just doing all these other things to get at that by any means. Now, whether or not some of them may have had mixed motivations, well, it would be hard to say that none of them did. They were human, so likely some of them did have mixed motivations.
Can we bring an application here to our own situation here in the church? Should we not have land and stuff working in the church so we can prepare for defense? I mean, essentially, if nobody knows how to use an SUV and a gun, there will be no defense. You'll just have to take whatever happens. Is that not applicable to the defense?
That's a very good question, Mike. I think our new church should have a rifle range. I think it'd be an excellent idea.
And barracks.
Yeah, but I'd also like to have a trap and skeet range in case we're attacked by ducks. So.
Killer ducks.
Killer ducks, yeah. So, okay, well, on that note, we'll stop. Wayne, would you close in prayer for us?